Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander.
Joe, great to have you back on the show, which is a rhyme.
Hey, Dan. Good to be here again.
Yeah. So I was just saying, we wanted to get you back on because this has been one of our most successful recent episodes. I think unsurprisingly, because agencies have a lot of trouble kind of like getting lost, forest from the trees stuff in terms of what to do new business wise. And what I love about the way that you're approaching this is there's so much room for like low hanging fruit and easy wins just through these sort of like little behavioral changes that go with the process of the way people buy, specifically within the proposal. So before we get into all of that, for those that missed the first episode, just real quick, would you mind kind of going through your background a little?
Yeah, I've been an entrepreneur straight out of high school. And probably my biggest run was running an agency for about 12 years. I never planned on hiring anyone. I was a freelancer, but due to some RSI risk issues and a book that I read, I ended up hiring I had about 10 people at my peak and loved building systems, loved leading a team, loved finding our niche and serving our customers. So that's my main background. And then I've done other startups as well.
That makes sense. And from the last episode, you were also running an agency for a long time. And what was it that kind of inspired you to build a software business around proposals?
Yeah, so Smart Pricing Table is my full-time gig now. It's interactive B2B proposal software. But full transparency, most of my customers are agencies. I know the industry, and I think it's really smart to specialize. I was building proposals all month long. Probably about six months into my agency, we were really starting to get our process down. We lost some big contracts, and so we had to get better at selling. And I was using one of the big box providers for probably about a year and a half, and eventually just kind of decided, you know what, this doesn't load fast enough. It doesn't have quite the features we need. Let's build a scope of work tool so we can generate the scope really quick, bring it back into this other system that we're using, and then go that direction. Kind of stumbled into it, but just found that I friggin' love the world of proposals. And we ended up doing a whole system. And then about a year and a half ago, I took that to the market as Smart Pricing Table.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's the only time I've heard somebody utter those words. I love the world of proposals. Usually it's the exact opposite sentiment.
Yeah.
So that's super interesting. And to get into that, like working with agencies now, why do most agencies hate making proposals and why are they so often unsuccessful in their efforts?
Yeah, well, I've had a few business friends say, Joe, I love your product because it's such a boring thing, but it's so helpful. I think the thing with proposal writing, it's kind of comparable to writing content for your website. The blinking carrot inside of Word, just this feeling of, I'm not really sure where to go with this thing. Writer's block, all those kind of things really slow us down. But it's also, it feels like you're taking time away from execution, or you're taking time away from the sales call. And you also have this looming thing over your head, which is this all going to be in vain? This proposal that I'm putting all this time into, is my prospect actually going to read it? Are they going to appreciate the detail and the stuff I'm laying out here? Or is it just going to be a ghosting situation? So I think because we don't have a good system, it's not any fun. But if you had to mow your lawn without a lawnmower, if you didn't have the tools to keep your yard in shape, it would be really frustrating too. And I think that's the missing key: is find the tool, find the process, find the system so that it can be fun.
Yeah, that makes sense. And with that, what is like when you're working with agencies before they're working with Smart Pricing Table or any other software, how are they typically handling it and why, and what typically happens when there isn't that system in place? Like what's the next best thing that you see?
Spell that out a little bit more. I want to give you a good answer.
Yeah, I guess like how do you typically see this playing out and like what makes it so arduous? Is it just that it's on Word and it's kind of reinventing the wheel each time? Or is it more a problem of like the wrong people are handling this that are caught between too many other tasks? And how do you see kind of a better way?
Yeah, I definitely think one of the big things that I say, and actually we have a guide, the Profitable Proposal Blueprint. One of the things I talk about is folks will use a software like Word or Google Docs. And unfortunately, it doesn't have the kind of settings or the kind of features that you need to write good proposals. I think proposal specific software is a really big thing, and not having that can really slow people down. Another thing that makes it painful is it's really, I look at business as kind of like a cavern. I have a flashlight. I'm shining around in the cavern and I'm discovering all these different things, these cracks and crevices that I didn't know were there. And then all of a sudden, this whole new room that I didn't even know about. And I think for so many folks, they haven't thought critically about their proposal process. What do we actually want to do? How much should we be charging for it? What are some synergistic other services that can come along with this so that we can make more money and they can get a better result because of it? I think not examining it, not having the mind space to actually think through it, those are two other big items that make it arduous.
Yeah, I love that metaphor. That's so good. Just kind of like wandering around in the dark and business being like that in a lot of ways, probably in all sorts of domains, probably in operations too. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Like, what are some of those upsell wins that maybe some of your clients didn't fully appreciate at first?
Yeah, well, I like giving examples, right? So your listeners can have something to grab onto and relate with. So let's talk about like a cold email campaign. Let's say I work mostly with marketing agencies, so maybe that's something that you offer. One of the things that can happen is if you haven't explored that particular part, you haven't looked at that offering close enough, you might do something like, you're defining it and you say, hey, we'll do a cold email outreach campaign for you. And it's $1,500 a month. And we'll create the sequences and we'll help you load in the contacts, the cold leads, and then we'll run the campaign for you. Okay. So looking at that, maybe I haven't thought about that critically. Consider that one of the parts of this dark cave that's been unexplored. Well, the challenge is you're up for so many surprises, right? There's some level of detail there, but if you were to shine the light inside of that dark area, you'd find that there's a lot more specifics, a lot of other things that you can go into. And if you outline things, if you take a step back and just work on the business, work on that particular offering, it can go a lot smoother. So for instance, what I might do, again, I work with a lot of agency owners. With our software, we actually do like a concierge kickoff call where I help folks set up line items. But I might break that down into a few different line items. First thing I might do is say, let's develop personas. Okay, you're doing cold outreach. Who the heck are we trying to talk to? So let's develop a main persona, maybe a secondary persona. And I could spell out exactly how we're going to do that. Not exactly, but I might say in a particular line item, create personas and meet for 1 hour to talk about your common folks that you sell to. What are their challenges? What are some of their interests and likes? And define that. And the deliverable is a persona report, something like that. So that could be its own line item and say that's $750. And you've outlined it. There's a scope. It can't go to the moon. It's contained. Then the next thing you might do is think through list building. I'm getting into this cavern again and I'm making all these discoveries. Oh crap, list building's really freaking, it's more complicated. I hadn't thought critically about this, right? What are the regions that I want to target? What are the company sizes? And so one of the things you could have a line item that says list sample generation, where your customer fills out a questionnaire and then you generate a sample list of like 100 potential prospects. And then they go through and they score each one so that you as the agency can do a lookalike kind of thing, a lookalike list and keep going. So you get the idea, taking those individual pieces, exploring them, defining them clearly, and then making individual modules or line items so that customer knows what they're going to get and you know what you're actually offering. That's exploring the cave.
That's really cool. And I'm sure that there's all sorts of things where it's like, we do this all the time, but we take it for granted. So we don't ever like take apart the pieces of the puzzle. Like I think a lot of times I remember it's like one of these classic copywriting case studies where they talk about like Schlitz beer had an ad in the 1800s and they just described their process of making beer, which was identical to every other beer company, but they were just the first ones to say, first we take the hops and then we do this, that, and the third. And I feel like there's a dynamic like that can exist with proposal writing where you're essentially just putting a cost to certain elements of that, or at least describing it, so on from there. So I think that's really cool. I think one thing that I know that you talk a lot about is clarity and kind of getting across to your prospects that you've done this before. How do you best do that in a proposal, in your opinion?
Making things clear. If you've got a pen and a pad, this is the summary or the suggested format that I usually do. So again, I like breaking down the bigger pieces into smaller line items that you can then reuse. That's key. That makes proposal writing fun because I'm not doing everything from scratch every time. But when you actually go to create a line item, how do you make it clear? So what I typically do is I'll start with like a summary sentence. So if I'm doing this cold email campaign or the persona development, I would use a sentence or two describing the point of developing personas. Maybe I want to sell it a little bit, right? This is why this is important. Read this case study on why personas are so vital for outreach. Then what I do is I'll say work included and then a bulleted list. So again, you're breaking the bigger ideas down. So this is, we're exploring a smaller cave in this case, and we're breaking it down into smaller pieces. When we say we're going to generate a persona for a customer, what do we actually mean by that, right? Okay, so first thing is we're going to do this, and then we're going to follow up with this. Then we're going to have a review meeting to make sure that we're on track, and then we're going to have a final deliverable, okay? So then I like to follow up with limitations. I like to use the analogy of putting a fence around your work. It doesn't go on forever. So limitations like this is limited to 2 personas and a maximum of 10 hours. I can't tell you how many times I put a max like that, just a straight hours max in a fixed bid line item and had the 0 issue with the customer. It's like, okay, great. And then under any limitations, then I would suggest upsells. What if they want another persona? What if they want to do actual customer interviews, right? When you bring in the idea of line item upsells, which our software does really well, it can really get you thinking about defining and what's available in a particular line item. But again, summary sentence, work included, bulleted list, limitations, and then upsells. I think it doesn't have to, that might sound complicated. It doesn't really need to be. It can be still very straightforward. But I think that can give you some clarity so that your project can't get, way over budget.
Let's face it, building proposals is a pain for most agencies. It drains your time and energy, and the fear of putting in all that effort only to be ghosted by prospects is real. But what if I told you there's a better way? Introducing Smart Pricing Table, the game-changing interactive proposal software designed specifically for agencies like yours. Developed by a former agency owner, their powerful tool cuts down on the back and forth, incorporates upsells seamlessly, and lets you build proposals at lightning speed. No more grinding it out and leaving money on the table. It's time to create a repeatable system where your prospects can upsell themselves. Learn more at smartpricingtable.com/DAG and schedule a demo today.
So I know another thing you're big on is like relative brevity, right? And kind of thinking of this more like a brochure than a Bible.
Right.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? Like how is a brochure different than a typical proposal and so on?
Yeah, I think if you're too vague in a proposal or a line item, you're asking for scope creep, you're asking for pain. If you're too specific, it just rubs people the wrong way. Like, really? Like, it's exactly 800 words, not a word more, or 825 or something like that. The goal is what you want to do when you're defining a service offering is you want to define it enough so that it's clear what the spirit is, right? If I've put 3 or 4 things in there and there's another small item that gets thrown in and we don't even bill for it, no big deal. But a cold email campaign is not a cold email campaign plus LinkedIn, right? If you just called it outreach and something super vague like that, you're really opening yourself up. If I've defined it and I've put some actual numbers and some clarity, of course I can go over a little bit, not necessarily a big deal, but I have the spirit, the size, so that I can make arguments for why something's done or we would need to go hourly to do more.
Right. And I like that. And I think that kind of like eliminated one of my questions, which is sometimes if you overprescribe something, then it can add a lot of friction to the sales process and sort of like close down creativity and stuff or create confusion or all these sorts of things. And I think to tie back to what we were talking about earlier with upsells, one thing that you talked about in the previous episode that I think is really big is the power of not assuming things. Can you talk about that a little bit more? And if there's any stories that come to mind, that's always great.
Well, one of the big things is, I think there's lots of categories with the types of things you'd assume, like budget, their interest on things. Running my agency, one of the things, actually, I used to tell my sales guy, I'd run into his office after some surprise would happen, and I'd say, look, this is what we do every time. Assume freaking nothing, right? Assume, and now, of course I'm being facetious here, but the point is like, you don't know what your customer's absolute budget is. I think I told a story on the last episode I was on, Dan, of we had a 25K max customer who ended up self-selecting an additional $9,000 just because we had upsells on the proposal, right? Don't assume that because maybe you feel like you're too small and they're too much in the big time for you, and so they're not going to go there. No, create a great proposal, have good references, have a good portfolio, and just go for it. And then I would also say, like, as far as offerings go, I think a lot of times with upsells, maybe we don't include them because we think someone doesn't particularly want this. But with a cold email campaign, I could include an upsell for LinkedIn outreach, right? Somewhat similar. There's a lot of parallels there. I could include like some sales consulting on like getting stuff done. Have them be optional, but don't assume that the customer wouldn't want them. I can't tell you how many times I've been surprised by someone checking a box that I didn't know they wanted.
Yeah. And how often do you have customers or clients, or maybe you in previous lives, just testing stuff that they don't even have the capability for yet based on putting it out there and seeing how it plays out?
Yeah, that's a really interesting, and you could do that with like a small sample, but it's kind of nice because if you do it well and you sell something that you've kind of looked in, you've considered the risk, it's a great way to sell something first and then figure out your process as you're going. Of course, there are going to be some pitfalls with that. I don't have an exact scenario in my mind where we did that, but actually, I know we did, we had a really big project at one point where there were some more advanced UX stuff and we were outlining it because we had someone on the team that could do well with it. But that's a really interesting idea. I'm going to noodle on that some more.
Yeah, I guess it's better than building out the capability and finding out nobody wants it, but it's a fine line, right? You gotta find the right balance there.
It reminds me of creating a landing page or a SaaS product and just directing traffic to it, and it's not even ready, but you're trying to learn. So I think that could be a really good technique. A good example of that might be maybe you're mostly a web design company, but you do a little bit of SEO, and you put together like a simple SEO audit, right? Take some time and just think through what could be included, what are some limitations so it can't get out of control. And then, surprisingly, someone says, I love that. That sounds great. You outlined it. It sounds like you know what you're doing here. I'll go for it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think while we're on the topic of upsells, one thing you talk about is the idea of, maybe you've covered this a little previously, but the idea of making baseline items more affordable by like removing the parts, making them into upsells. Maybe we're retreading some old ground, but I'd love to hear like what that might look like if there's any other ideas that come to mind.
Yeah, I think a lot of times what prospects see in a proposal is this rigid option, this rigid setup, and they sense that that's just my choice, right? And they sense that because we made them think that, right? There's no optionality, there's no dynamic portion to it. What I think of, I love using an analogy of selling like a blog. So I had a web design agency. We sold, a blog was a common line item in our proposals. And the blog, you might have like your homepage loop and you might have an individual post, but there's a lot of other things. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your listeners can connect with this. So you could sell a blog for $1,000 or $1 million, right? And so in order to make the blog more attractive, the way that we set things up is we just have it real simple, right? Those two things includes a loop and then an individual blog post. But then we'd have upsells like author bio pages. Would you like that? Related blog posts. You can think of a million different things, social sharing, right? And you think through each of those and figure out a good pricing for it. But because they're upsells, it keeps your base costs low. Maybe the blog is $1,000 and the upsells could get you an additional $1,500. But I'd rather get $1,200 because they got the base blog and maybe one upsell than have it be $2,500 and they're like, there's just no way. And I could also risk the entire project. So upsells inside of a line item are a great way to lower the entry cost for the line item itself. And what I found is they end up just checking stuff anyways.
It's funny because, and I've talked about this a lot, but I think like, especially in the B2B space, we fool ourselves into thinking that we're like so logical and sophisticated and smart, but then you see the same dynamics that would play out in the consumer space where people are just like, I passed by an ice cream place and they had a nice sign, so I got ice cream. It's like, it's that kind of thing. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like, how is sending somebody a proposal and then letting them click through stuff different than saying, hey, here are all the options. Like, what do you like best live?
Right. Yeah, well, some of it, it's funny. Your little thing there made me think of, my wife is really into like natural foods and healthy eating and all that kind of stuff. Before we got married, I was not. I ate lean cuisines and I was typical bachelor. But every time I go into Safeway, I almost every single time get a kombucha. And it's literally like, I see it, it's an option. Oh, it sounds great, right? So simply presenting it, right? If you think about it, if you were doing a new website and you were looking at a proposal and it said blog, and you saw these different things on there, like related posts. Oh my goodness, George, he writes tons of content. I could totally see where we wish we would have had that on our last blog. Or, social sharing, but with like a twist, like, this particular feature. I think what can come into play is a little bit of FOMO. And if your upsells are a reasonable price, that the FOMO plus the affordability, I think, can increase the price overall, right? Maybe it's a $1,500 blog, but 150, 250, 350 upsells, and all of a sudden they chose it, right? It's not you selling them on it. You're not going to deal with buyer remorse later. It's like, no, you chose, right? Like, I didn't pressure you into this. And then it goes up and up. I feel like it's pretty much what happens to me every time I go to Jiffy Lube.
Yeah, at Jiffy Lube, it's probably a little more predatory, or a little more pressureful. Let's say I don't want to get sued by Jiffy Lube, but
when they show me that dirty air filter for the cabin, I start thinking about my kids, right? Like, I'm not going to be a bad dad. Like, that's got to be clean. Hey, how would you rate that on a scale of 1 to 10? Like, how dirty is that?
Yeah, it works so well. They've really mastered that. I got to give credit to whatever consultant busted into this Jiffy Lube process to get them to show off the AC units or whatever. So, and I guess tied to that, how do you feel about scarcity, in terms of like, you could always buy this upsell later? Is it more like, I could technically go back to the Trader Joe's, but I'm here now and I probably won't, so I might as well buy this candy bar while I'm in line? Or do you have customers or clients that are actually like, hey, we could do this thing later, but it's going to cost us more because then we've got to re-onboard you to it or whatever? Like, how do you kind of see that playing out?
I think it's definitely a consideration, right? Getting back to our cavern idea, exploring the cave, that's its own thing. Urgency, price changes over time. I think that's a helpful sales strategy, especially in the times that we're in right now with inflation. Prices can change. I'll say, I think a lot of times when you just make it easy, a quick check the box, it adds it on. It can really bring it into the here and now as a phase one. But I also think even if you didn't have a sense of urgency, or that didn't work and didn't result in a higher project budget, I think what's great about listing things as upsells or additional items to consider is that in your customer's mind, you've planted a seed, right? All of a sudden, the FOMO is driving them to start making a list of phase 2 items, because maybe they can't afford it right now, right? Of what they want to do next. So you've spurred them on, and you've put the foundation for a potential project in the future.
Yeah, I love that. And in my head, where my head starts going is like, okay, there's so many things we can come up with. We could have this as an add-on or that, until it's like a restaurant menu, basically. But I guess there comes a point at which you could have the opposite effect if people get analysis paralysis and confusion. So how do you recommend that for agencies that are listening to this, that are getting inspired? Like, what's that starting place? Like, what's the first thing you should aim for?
Don't overdo it. It's for sure, right? Because I can hear the counter argument. Joe, why do you line item everything out? Like a few paragraphs, just chill out, right? Why be so specific? I hear you. But again, it's between the two ditches. The two ditches being too vague or too specific. To bring that over here, it's too many options and too little options. You want to strike the balance there. If you have too little options, then it's easy to just look at your solution and say it's a yes or no, and sorry, no. Or you haven't given them any upsells at all. If you give them too many options, absolutely, analysis paralysis. We don't want that. And so a good way to handle that is you have your base project. I often will set this up in our templates. You've got a base project where you have 5, 10 line items that are outlining your offering. And then I love putting a section called additional items for consideration. It's its own category. I can kind of like compartmentalize it in my mind as the prospect and just put 2 or 3 items in there. And maybe base that off of your sales call, your intuition. In your library, you might have 50 line items that you could potentially put in there, but what ones are going to make the biggest impact? There's the classic thing in design. If everything is bold, nothing is bold. Yeah. If you put 30 things in there, they're going to look at none of them, right? So a few 5 to 10 baseline items for your core project that you're offering, 2 to 4 upsells and additional items. I think that's a good balance there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think we've covered the upsell angle a lot, which is definitely interesting and perhaps the most attractive thing. Then there's also the bottom half of the P&L, which is like the time savings, right? And all the costs that would normally go to proposals. I guess my first question is, instead of a what question, it's more of like a who question, which is like, who's putting this together ideally? How outsourceable is this? You might have an owner or a salesperson learning about needs. How do you go about delegating this the best way?
Yeah, the way that I did it at my agency, my lead developer would create the line items because he knew what it actually took. He knew how to spell it out. He knew what the time it would take and a good cost for it. Then as the CEO, I'd approve it. The pattern I like going after is your technical person defines the line item. Your CEO makes sure it's okay, right? Or your VP of sales, you're making sure it's not too technical. It has enough of a sales flair that it builds an appetite, et cetera. And then your salesperson is selling it. They can maybe tweak a few things. Some of that might require approval, but they're not actually creating it because you don't want them to define something in an inappropriate way that makes it balloon like crazy. So I'd offer that as a kind of a good way to operate. And with our software, we have a templating system and we have a line item library. And so I like the idea is my lead developer or a lead email campaign architect creates the template, they create the line items, and then the salesperson is then creating a proposal based on that template. And they can delete line items, they can add new line items, but they're not architecting. They're architecting the project in a way, but they're not architecting your offering, which you don't want them to do unless they're highly specialized and technical.
Right. It's kind of more like they have like some clay and they're just like cutting off stuff. It's not a fit.
Right.
So that makes a lot of sense. And to dig into, I know we talked about sales process a little bit last time. Probably won't go over everything, but I know that your software and other softwares kind of have the capability to track when people open and that kind of thing. What do you do with that information? You know, somebody's opening your proposal. How do you use that in the best way? And how do you use that in a way that respects your time as well?
One of the first questions I'd ask your listeners is, do you know when someone opens your proposal? If you're sending a PDF, the answer is no. If you're sending a Word or a Google Doc, the answer is no. And see my previous comment about proposal-specific software, right? Having that feature is a really big deal in and of itself, because maybe you haven't heard anything for 2 or 3 weeks. All of a sudden, they open it. The fact that you know that can be so helpful. I think that, when you look at cold outreach and like closing deals, like I heard something like you need on average like 5 to 6 touch points to get a first demo or first meeting with a cold lead. You want all the tools you can get, the helpful tools to help with the process of closing, bringing in the line. So the way our system works, because we focus on the scope of work, that's really my niche in the market. We track if they open different pages in the proposal, but we also track if they expand or collapse a line item, if they check an option or an upsell, or if they change quantity. I think being able to see not only what pages did they view, but what's their level of engagement with our actual service offering. If someone opened project kickoff call, they expanded that line item, and they clicked on on-site meeting, which I put as an upsell. What's that telling me as the salesperson? It's telling me, number one, they're looking at the proposal. That's great. That's a great win. A second thing is they're actually looking at our service offering. They're engaging with it, and they're even turning things off and on, perhaps to get a price. It gives me a sense of how serious am I as in their consideration, and how worthy is this prospect of my time as a salesperson, because I have limited time. So I think looking at it, getting some of that intel can really drive some of the follow-up and help bridge the gap and close the deal.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think a more standard sales process or a more conventional sales process is one for like B2B consultative and so on, whatever you want to call it, is one where you have an initial call, perhaps you're doing some discovery, depending on the complexity of the offer. Maybe there's another like 1 or 2 rounds of discovery, and then the proposal is like the last step. And then you're like, here's all the stuff we can do. And then there's the waiting game and the chasing game and all that stuff to get a decision. Do you agree with that? Or does this kind of flip the model? Is this more like, here's, let me talk to you. Here's all the stuff we can do. We're going to handle this more digitally. And then I'm going to see what you do behind the scenes and go from there. Yeah.
I think it can flip the model a bit. And the reason why that traditional flow, one of the reasons why that's in play is because proposals take so long to make. If you don't have a good system, if you haven't explored the cavern, they can just take so long. But what if you could make a proposal in 10 minutes? And I'm not kidding, right? Like, what if, build it off of a template, add 5 line items that weren't in the template, delete 2 that were, custom, make a few tweaks, and it's totally ready. All of a sudden, you can bring that in earlier, or you can get into deals that you previously wouldn't have because of time restraints. I think it can flip the model because you can bring that in sooner and add some of that brochure flavor to it and have the proposal a part of like maybe that secondary sales call where you're actually adding stuff with them potentially, or at least turning things off and on so that you can get a price and understand their needs better. I think it can bring it in a lot closer. You can get them a price a lot quicker, and boy, do prospects appreciate that. First to respond, first to get a proposal. Oh my word. That is like, if you don't hear anything, just take those 2 things, respond quickly and then get a proposal quickly. That can make the world of difference because it shows that you care.
Right. And, I think a lot of the back and forth and the hand wringing comes from sales process, how to get decision makers involved and that kind of thing. So thinking about a situation where like you've reached out to, let's say, a marketing manager, but you have to get whatever, a VP of marketing to sign off on that. How do you feel about how the proposal kind of like interworks with decision makers? Is it the sort of thing where it's like, here's the proposal, marketing manager, but if you want to buy this thing, then we probably recommend getting the decision maker on to the next step? How do you think about incentivizing that in order to get the people on the call that you need to be on there to spend $100,000 on a campaign or whatever it is?
I think an important question early on is, who are the people on your side that are involved in making this decision? Even if a proposal only takes me 10, 15 minutes, I would be hesitant if the only audience I'm ever going to get is more of an entry-level employee, someone that admin staff, that kind of stuff. So I always ask that. And I think sometimes we don't get something because we simply don't ask, right? There's like, it's just as powerful as offering something in your proposal and something for them to choose. It's also powerful to just say, hey, do you think John could get on this call? Now, you might still do it without John, but if John is a key decision maker, I'd certainly ask if he could be there. I don't want to repeat myself. I don't want to miss some great insights that he would have. And I certainly don't want support staff pitching my service, right? Or my proposal. Like, I want to be direct communication with the decision maker as much as I can.
Right. That makes sense. And I think a lot of agencies listening to this have a process whereby they learn a bit, they pitch, they ask questions, they send the proposal out, and then let the chips fall as they may. How do you feel about that? And what would you recommend is the right process for presenting the proposal?
I'm going to bring up my go-to proposal review meeting. I mentioned this on our last chat, but I think it's so valuable. If you heard this already, it's some review. If not, this is a fantastic strategy. The way I like doing things is you have that initial sales discovery call. and you get the information, you do your typical process. And then towards the end, you say, well, Dan, the next step in our process is to do a proposal review meeting. I'd like to set that up with you right now. You don't ask them if they want to. You just say it's part of your process. And it's a 20-minute meeting, and you schedule it right there. From a meeting, book a meeting. And as I covered last time, I think the real value there is I want to be able not to just give my proposal, but I want the opportunity to sell it. I want to be there with the people making decisions, showing them this is why I set up this way. Here are some things to consider. Like, by the way, I don't know if you've considered LinkedIn outreach, but we've paired that with a few other customers with our cold email stuff. And let me tell you some stats. This is crazy. I mean, and here's the cool thing, 30% more investment. Double your impact, 30% more investment, because we can reuse a lot of things, right? You can't do that in a proposal unless you've got a Loom video. You could, right? But the proposal review meeting, to be able to be dynamic and to sell your product, but also sell yourself. Maybe have a team member on the call who can speak to a technical thing. It's just so valuable. Unless you have really small ticket proposals, I'd be hard pressed to, not argue for that for most cases. If it's $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $10,000, $20,000, whatever, a meeting where you can actually go over it, I think is just so valuable.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And also, so you can just hear feedback live, and hear things you never would. So I think that's so great. And Joe, I think we've covered a lot more ground here, and this has been awesome. Where can people go to find out more and get involved in this? I know you have lots of resources that people can use to improve the proposal process.
Well, as I mentioned, my full-time thing these days is Smart Pricing Table. Built it 6 years ago for my agency, took it to the market a year and a half ago. And it has been so much fun. Just like with marketing companies, if you know your niche market, if you choose a vertical, it's like, wow, my business is fun again, right? Like, because all of a sudden you know how to talk, you know what kind of things to offer. Well, with Smart Pricing Table, we mostly focus on agencies. And if any of your listeners are open to a free trial, on our free trial kickoff, I mentioned this earlier, do a concierge kickoff call. So you can learn more about that at smartpricingtable.com. And if you're short on time, if you don't have time for a demo, download our free guide, The Profitable Proposal Blueprint. It's 5 helpful tips to build a proposal machine that in the end helps you be more profitable. So smartpricingtable.com, and there's a free guide option in our menu.
Awesome. And we'll get that all linked up in the show notes if you're on the go right now. So Joe, I really appreciate it, man. Let's do it again before long.
Love it. Thanks, Dan.